Hello. Thank you, Hito, for inviting me to help in your presentation to the chiropractors at Hokkaido. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I want to speak to you first a little bit about myself and where I come from, and that might be useful in helping to understand what the message of today is. So the first thing I'll tell you is that I practice chiropractic in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And I began my practice here, about 15 years ago, and you may recall, Hiro, from when you visited, that you got to look at our building now. But actually my experience in practice goes back to 1974 when I graduated from Palmer College of Chiropractic in Davenport, Iowa. And I'm reminded of my experience as a chiropractic student at the fountainhead of chiropractic, where I expected to see a lot of things that were different than what I actually experienced. For instance, I expected an education that was centered a lot around the vertebral subluxation. And I was there at a time when the college was moving away from a chiropractic-centered orientation toward one that is more medicalized. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. And so what I found soon after graduating was that I came to... Stop. So when I graduated and went to South Carolina to become a member of the Sherman College faculty, I went into practice and started going to the state association meetings, where I found that it was anything but a peaceful experience. What we know about the profession, it is simply not a homogeneous group of people. And what I found was that we had the straights on one side of the room and the mixers on the other side. There was a lot of consternation about what to do and how to do it in our profession, what techniques to use. All of these things became very emotional, and I even saw chiropractors battling with each other, going out into the parking lot and throwing fists at each other because they disagreed on how things should happen. So that's the kind of profession that we had in the 1970s when I began practice. And of course, one of the things I want to bring to your attention is that chiropractic is not about how your technique is done. It's not about whether or not you take x-rays or how high your fees are, but it comes down to what your objective is. And so we're going to focus on that here a little bit further. So what I wanted to bring to your attention about these many decisions that we make is that many things we do can help people. And I've often heard other colleagues say, well, as long as you're helping people, that's what really matters. And there's no argument against that. But let's look at how we help people and how to make our decisions about that particular part of the process. Let me bring to your attention Dr. Lyle Sherman's perspective on this. And in fact, I'm going to have him speak to you a little bit about the way that we think and the service we receive. Now, Dr. Sherman was very well known in the profession, and he was the assistant director of the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic. And you see in this picture where he's receiving the 1955 Chiropractor of the Year award from Dr. Palmer himself. And I'm going to play a short piece of him speaking to give you an idea about how he views the thinking of the chiropractor.
Dr. Lyle Sherman. I thought I heard when I came in the tent a few minutes ago that BJ said, when I get to heaven. I've never heard anybody say go to heaven, and I don't know how he's going to get everywhere. And then he said something too about when he got there, he was going to tell St. Peter to do something. He'd probably do it too. Throughout history, every great movement has had some great wall, the same great wall of established opinion to batter down. That dogged persistence of man to hold on to the accepted opinion. It is said that the fear of the unknown causes man to hold on to that which is established. Hidebound opinions are passed on down to us by our educators and our parents alike. Our parents survived with things as they were, therefore we will survive. The average man is a victim of established thinking. There seems to be a natural skepticism of the masses to accept any new principle that is set before them. No, medicine is not our worst enemy. It is the tendency of man to fight change, to resist any movement that changes. None of us will admit that we are guilty also.
And so what we're going to do is look at how our thinking becomes the way that we make our decisions. And so here's an example of things that we think we see and we don't necessarily see. For instance, is it possible that this image is constantly expanding? It may look like it is, but pretty soon you can find out that the image is perfectly stationary. And there's many examples of how our perceptions can lead us down the wrong path. Let me move on to one thing that Reggie Gold said. He said, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So as we change our perspective on life from time to time, it appears as though the whole world changes, when in reality we know the whole world doesn't change just because we changed our thoughts, but our ability to see things is what changes. With time, how and who we are may go through many changes, in fact. I'll give you a couple more examples of that. Here's Reggie. Reggie Gold, of course, was quite a leader in teaching philosophy to our profession. And he said in the 1970s, if you're not out to change the world, then everything else is just Mickey Mouse, meaning it just doesn't really matter that much. It's a cartoon. It's not the reality that we seek to understand. And of course, Reggie changed. I can remember that was what he said back in the 70s, but 30 years later, he had a different attitude toward life. He said, if you're not out to change the world, your whole life is a big waste of time filled with missed opportunities. So Reggie was all about changing things, and of course, changing things chiropractically for the better. I remember one time when I was on the faculty at Sherman College, Reggie would invite all of the faculty members and students to share their home where they had a beautiful in-ground swimming pool. And one of the things Reggie would do that I thought was an interesting, you know what, I don't want to share that with these people. So if we keep in mind that how we view the world and what we're thinking about is not changing the world, but our perception, let us look at Dr. Sherman's view of how we set our objectives. And now he's going to speak to you about the objectives in the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic. And so let me turn on a little audio clip for that.
We don't have a corner on adjustments in that clinic. As far as techniques are concerned, there may be better techniques than what we use. But we try to keep this one thing straight in our minds, that we're dealing with a fundamental principle and we don't want to confuse the principle with the technique.
And so if we're not confusing a principle with a technique, how do we determine what's right for us to use? And here's a principle I'd like you to take away from this discussion today. Mission is what drives method. It doesn't work the other way around. So if you know what your goal is, then that won't change, but your methods will change with time. A good example is the game of tennis. If we look back to about 1,000 years ago, the French were amongst the first to use a little ball and to play a game that became tennis of today. And these Franciscan monks would hit a ball with their hands, and there wasn't even a net yet in that particular picture. But they found out that their hands became very painful, and so they began to wear a glove that had a webbing on it, and the glove took away some of the hurt from hitting the ball. Next came a solid wooden paddle, and the solid wooden paddle eventually gave way to a racket like close to what we use in modern times today. And so you can see that as the game developed, we found better and better methods of playing the game. But what did not change was the mission itself. The mission to hit the ball in a particular place in a particular way that your opponent would not be able to return it successfully. So mission is what is constant. Methods change with time. And of course you can see an example here of a modern tennis racket with all of the sophistication of what we've come out with by looking at the various things like material improvements, electrical charges, and so on and so forth. Even the balls changed with time. We found better ways to make tennis balls. But remember, mission is what doesn't change. Method does. Now we're going to try to drive that point home by looking at how this might apply. Here in the city of Tokyo, you might find an individual deciding to get in their automobile and drive up here toward Hokkaido. And what that person would do is they would begin to drive north. If, on the other hand, that person were to begin to drive southwest on their way to Sapporo, you would know that that person has a method that is absurd, simply does not work. And so if, on the other hand, you found out that the person going southwest is trying to get to Kyoto, you would say, well, that makes sense. So it's always mission and method that need to relate to each other in an appropriate sort of a way. Now, a well-chosen objective becomes your key decision. Choose a mission that makes sense for you, and then you'll always find better and better methods of achieving that mission. That's why Dr. Sherman said, let's not confuse a principle with a technique. A principle relates to a mission, but a technique is just another method. Today's discussion is really about how to choose our objective. What is our mission to be, and why do we choose that? We're going to be exploring the reasoning that goes into choosing methodology. And we're going to particularly talk about this vertebral subluxation-centered mission. The minority of chiropractors practice in what we call the LACVS, the Location, Analysis, and Correction of Vertebral Subluxation. That model is the minority point of view in chiropractic. The public sees many other things in chiropractic offices. What else do they see? Well, they'll see things like exercise therapy, massage therapy. They will see nutrition therapy, selling vitamins to patients. They'll see, other than massage, they'll see acupuncture, selling products like better mattresses, cushions, all kinds of supports. But keep in mind that becoming an ergonomic expert is not the mission of the chiropractor. The chiropractor's job is not to take the place of nutrition experts. And so we're going to look at how do you make a decision about what you want to do in your practice. The mixed messages are obvious. There is some chiropractors wanting to practice holistic medicine, homeopathy, herbals, pain care. Pain care is a big one. Lots of chiropractors focus primarily on pain, acupuncture, massage, nutrition, psychological counseling, etc. And so pretty soon the public sees all of these other things represented as chiropractic. And while somebody might benefit by putting special insoles in their shoes, that's not the practice of chiropractic, at least not vertebral subluxation-centered chiropractic. So I want to talk to you more about how do we make the decision to focus on that thing instead of all of these other many things that we're looking at on the screen. And pause, please. So I was recently at the Palmetto State Chiropractic Association, that's a state seminar in South Carolina. And I listened to an individual try to describe this distinction between what is chiropractic and what is not chiropractic. And I thought he explained that so well that I want to show you a short clip that gives a little insight into that. This is Bobby Finley. And
there is a publication in our profession that we all get in the mail once a month. You get it. I've been retired 10 years.
So all of these differing procedures really boil down to distinctions between two major missions that chiropractors seem to be on, one of the two. They're either on a mission that we will call centered on the vertebral subluxation, or they're on a mission centered on conditions. Let me point out that this is the dominant model since 1895. If you want to know where D.D. Palmer was at, he started on this mission. He was trying to get rid of the deafness, a medical condition on a deaf guy. And this mission of vertebral subluxation centered practice didn't really come into existence until about 75 to 80 years later in the 1970s. So we'll talk a little bit more about those too, but do keep in mind all of chiropractic is either here or there. And there's some interesting things that develop based upon which mission the chiropractor chooses. And so the objective drives the procedures. Remember, we said mission drives method. Mission is the same as objective. It drives what we do. Procedures are the methods. Mission, method. On the vertebral subluxation centered side, we have the spinal analysis, which is designed to detect the presence of vertebral subluxation. We have the misalignment that we look for. We have the analysis to obtain a precise listing of how to make an adjustment. We have to consider which technique is going to be the most effective for a particular person. And then we have both pre and post adjustment analysis. On the condition-centered side, we are focused on the history, the case history, the examination, trying to find out if there's a medical problem. The diagnosis is focused on the complaint of the patient. If their elbow hurts, you're not looking at their knee. You're looking for the patient complaint area. We select the appropriate therapy in order to treat the condition on this side, and we consider the safety and effectiveness of that therapy, as well as to direct it at the appropriate symptom. So keep in mind now, all of chiropractic is focusing on one of these two objectives, but they're not the same objective. All procedures on both sides of this chart have the potential to help people. So it's not about whether we're trying to help a person, it's what is our objective that we're trying to consider. If all those procedures have the ability to potentially help an individual, then why is it that some chiropractors have chosen to practice exclusively in the vertebral subluxation centered model? We'll try to answer that question. Here's the first part of that question. Are all good things chiropractic? You could decide to wash and fold someone's laundry for them, and that's a good thing. But is it chiropractic just because it's good? Or you could dance in the street with someone, and that's good for a person too. And you know, these are crazy questions, or they're silly questions, we might say. But the point is to underscore that we need to clearly define what it is that we're trying to do for a person, not just general goodness. Outspoken critics of the vertebral subluxation centered model have looked at that and said that ultimately it may be a dangerous model. It may not even be a good scientific model. They've questioned whether or not subluxation of the spinal column is dogma or science. And these are articles that have come out of peer-reviewed journals that we're looking at now. And here it says from Dr. Winterstein and Stephen Pearl that the widespread assertion of the clinical meaningfulness of vertebral subluxation brings ridicule from the scientific community. And they say that it is causing a confusion within the chiropractic profession. We'll look at that a little further. Here's Dr. Jim Zigafus speaking on that same subject, and let him speak to you himself.
So if in fact, do we treat heart disease? No. You just said that the body can heal itself of any disease known to man. What do you treat? Nothing. Well, what do I do as a chiropractor? The thing that I do as a chiropractor is determine that every visit somebody comes in and walks out with less subluxation than they walked in. That my entire purpose is to correct subluxation. If I correct the subluxation and I'm capable of maintaining that correction so that there's maximum expression of light from the brain to the tissue cell, then what we've done for that individual is increased his or her potential, period. We haven't treated anything. We haven't treated symptoms. We haven't treated conditions. We haven't treated diseases. We have brought the potential of this organism up to the level in where it can heal itself. because there's an intelligence in here, in you, and the greatest doctor in the world is inside of you. And we talk about us being healers. The only person that you can ever heal is yourself.
And so what Dr. Ziegerfuss was saying is it's about the potential of a person rather than just changing their condition at any given time. Dr. Joe Strauss, the well-known author of the many blue books, was being cited in another blue book that recently was published where it talks about the chiropractor's objective. This is by Claude Lessard, one of my former students, in fact. And he said that an objective chiropractor is a chiropractor who chooses to practice only the chiropractic objective and nothing else. Here's Dr. Lessard, and we're going to listen to a short piece of him being interviewed on this subject as well. Dr. Lessard is now being interviewed by Daniel Knowles about the paradigm of change that we alluded to, going from the condition treating to the vertebral subluxation centered model.
It was being timed out. And in those days, up to BJ's death, chiropractic was used to get sick people well. Really, that's what it was used for. There was no, and doing it better than medicine without drugs and surgery. That was it. One cause, one cure. There was the HO movement and so forth. However, during that time, whatever happened there, Reggie Gold was already preparing a blueprint to start a postgraduate school. He was teaching at Columbia at that time, postgraduate school in philosophy, and heard about Gelati. Tom Gelati wanted to start a school. And for some reason, they both connected, and they listened to each other. And Reggie says, I have the blueprint and everything, but I like your idea much better than mine. And Tom says, why? He said, because me, I would have to take them as graduate and have them unlearn everything they learned, teach them something new. Now we could teach them right from the start, something that's right. And they started Sherman College. So you see now there was a time.
And so Dr. Lessard is saying here that when Reggie Gold and Tom Gilardi and a number of others who aren't being mentioned here got together, a new paradigm was being formed in the 1970s that coincided with the founding of Sherman College, but not only because Sherman College happened. This is a natural evolution, and we'll look at how this developed. Now I'm going to also show you another very short discussion. This is another interview where Tom Gilardi, the founder of Sherman College, is being introduced and interviewed by Liam Schubel about this question of the new model that came into being about that time when Sherman College was founded. And I skipped. Let me see if I can back up one and move this over. Let's try it one more time.
So I asked Reggie what he would charge to come down and speak to the group. And I think I was so I wanted Dr. Sherman to move a little bit more to the new model. And so he said he would. And he said he'd take a donation, whatever, that's it. Well, I don't know if we had a fee set up that we're going to try to get a fee, but we did. I know he lost on the deal. Reggie did. But he came down and when he spoke, and he gave a moving talk. And I did get Dr. Sherman there. And so I asked Dr. Sherman what he thought of the talk. And he picked little things that had more to do with nothing. He couldn't think of anything. Yeah. Because he agreed with it. And there's nothing he could argue with. So he tried to argue with it and then just realized there's nothing to argue. He didn't say anything that Sherman could disagree with.
So let me explain that what Dr. Gilardi was referring to there is that Dr. Sherman was a researcher, and he did a lot of research in the 1940s and 1950s when the model was still about condition-centered care. Getting sick people well was the mantra back then. We want to get sick people well using chiropractic care, and they did it very successfully. But this new model was coming about gradually. So when Sherman College was founded and Dr. Sherman was being honored by giving the name of the college to be his name, he was still kind of centered in the condition-centered model himself. And that was what Dr. Gilardi was trying to explain to us there. So let me just see if I can get us back.
I asked Reggie what
And I
he
want
would
to try to,
charge to come down and speak to the group.
let me see if I can get this to the next slide. And so here's Dr. Joe Strauss also being interviewed on this subject. And here Kevin Wilmot is asking him about the objective of care. And he mentions Reggie Gold's foray into spinology, which is another profession that he tried to start at one time that would only talk about vertebral subluxation when he felt like chiropractic was being lost totally. But here, this is an interesting thing because Reggie called it the third paradigm, which really, for our purposes today, is the second paradigm of chiropractic.
The purpose and the objective, the mission of what we do as chiropractors, because we know that everybody needs that, whether they have a disease or whether they have no disease, or whether they've just been born or whether they've just been, or they're, 5 minutes away from dying or whatever. They still need to have that interference in their nervous system corrected.
Right.
And I think I don't know whether his idea is superior, or whether we're too far gone as a profession, and so I'm just kind of a voice in the wilderness trying to bring us back to that idea, which was his idea. He just changed the word and called it spinology rather than objective straight chiropractic.
Right.
I think people say to me, well, what's the difference between what Reggie did with spinology and what you're doing with objective chiropractic? And say nothing.
Nothing really. Yeah.
There's nothing.
Sadly, about a year ago, Joe Strauss passed away. Joe is a fabulous individual who was noted for writing many of what we call the blue books on chiropractic philosophy. And this picture here, you can see where several years ago I was invited by Dr. Mitsu Shiakawa to organize a seminar that would include both technique, philosophy, and history of the profession. And so there's Naomi and Mitsu Shiakawa. Perry Rush came along to teach Blair technique, which is interesting because at that particular seminar, it was the first time that Blair was offered in Japan, to the best of my knowledge, and I've tried to check that, and I believe that's correct. Iris Strauss and Joe Strauss, who you just heard from, and myself and my wife Charlene. So we had a seminar there, and we had the experience of having some really great chiropractors from Japan and from the United States get together and talk about the philosophy of the profession and the objective of care. And so choosing the objective demonstrates certain commitments to specific values. And so I'd like to point those out. And the first one is an awareness of the intelligent potential of the body. And now we're referring to those who have chosen to exclusively practice in the vertebral subluxation centered model. Concerned that vertebral subluxations insult the nerve system to the extent that they interfere with the flow of mental impulse from brain to body. And the third point is that the desire rather, to facilitate the communication between the brain and body in the most natural way. And so it's not about how do we get rid of the symptom or even whether we address the symptom. It's about people with symptoms and people without symptoms all need a good nerve supply at all times. That's that vertebral subluxation centered goal or mission. D.D. Palmer seemed to have the same dedication, but of course he came along at the beginning. And so while what we have in our vertebral subluxation centered model may not be focused on the condition, he started from that place, but the discovery is what naturally led to the evolution that we have today. And D.D. said it has been one of the rules of my life that what is worth doing at all is worth doing well. And he said that this is especially true in chiropractic, and that is the foundation for a coming science, and he's speaking futuristically here, that is destined to be the greatest of this or any age. So he had a vision. More contemporarily, the philosopher Ayn Rand said that nothing can be reasonable or beautiful unless it is made by one central idea, and that idea sets every detail. Like Rand's philosophy, vertebral subluxation is a central concept, and it has a very clear objective, which we'll go into in some more depth here in just a little bit. Since all the details are determined by that central idea, it's very important to have a definable objective. And so let's talk about the objective. We have vertebral subluxation interfering with the ability of the brain to communicate with the rest of the body. Corrected, the brain is in touch with the body. That is a clear objective, and it builds from there a central idea that everything else follows from. The Palmers founded the profession on that getting sick people well paradigm. However, their vision clearly set the stage for the natural evolution of the vertebral subluxation-centered paradigm. BJ explains it here in what he called the big idea. So another short clip to help you to follow BJ's thinking on that subject.
A slip on the sidewalk is a small thing. It happens to millions. A fall from a ladder is a small thing. That happens to millions. The slip of the fall produces a subluxation, and that subluxation is a small thing. The subluxation produces pressure on the nerve, and that pressure is a small thing. And the pressure cuts off the flow of mental impulses, and that decreased flowing is a small thing. And that decreased flowing produces a diseased body, and that is a big thing for that man. And multiply that sick man by 1,000, and you control the physical and mental welfare of a city. Multiply that man by 1,000,000, and you shape the physical and mental destiny of a state. And multiply that man by 156 million, and you forecast and can prophesy the physical and mental stasis of a nation. So the slip of the fall, the subluxation, the pressure, the flow of mental impulses, and this is big enough to control the thoughts and actions of a nation. And that's the power that rests with you. Now comes the man. Any one man is a small thing. This man gives an adjustment, and that adjustment is a small thing. The adjustment replaces the subluxation, that's a small thing. And the adjusted subluxation releases pressure upon nerves, and that's a small thing. The released pressure restores health to a man, and that is a big thing to that man. Multiply that well man by 1,000, and you step up the physical and mental stasis of a city. Multiply that well man by 1,000,000, you increase the efficiency of a state. And multiply that well man by 156 million, and you have produced a healthy, wealthy, and better race for posterity. So the adjustment of the subluxation to release pressure upon nerves, to restore mental impulse flow, to restore health, is big enough to rebuild the thoughts and actions of the world. So the idea that knows the cause, that can correct the cause of disease, is one of the biggest ideas I know. Without it, nations fall. With it, nations rise. The idea is the biggest idea I know.
And so BJ was talking about a big idea, and yet it's oftentimes easy to get confused because of the levels of abstraction. So we want to try to seek clarity in our idea. I want to show you a little bit about what we'll call the levels of abstraction. Suppose I am thinking about a single person. If I tell you I'm thinking about a person, you don't really know anything about who that might be. There are 4 or 5 billion of us on the planet. It could be any one of them. If I were to give you a little bit more concrete information and say, I'm now thinking about a person who is an artist, I have narrowed it down and removed billions of possibilities to only those who spend their lives pursuing a form of art. If I become a little more concrete and I say I'm thinking about a musician, then you know that I'm not talking about somebody who paints with oil on a canvas or someone who writes poetry. I'm talking about a particular type of an artist. So we've gone from 4 to 5 billion possibilities down to a few million on the whole planet. If we then say, let me give you a more abstract or more concrete rather than abstract idea, and I say I'm talking about a musician who plays an instrument, you know I'm not talking about one who only sings. We're talking about somebody who produces the music with their hands and with the air and so on. If I say I'm now speaking about a violinist, I'm going more concrete from a person on the planet to someone who does only certain things. Now we've gone from billions down to a million or so on the whole planet. I'm going to keep going more concrete and say, what about a violinist in an orchestra? We can say any particular orchestra in any city. Then what we've done is we've narrowed it down even further. If I say, well, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, then what we know is we've gone from billions down to about 100 people. And then if I say the first row of violins, now we've gone from about 100 people more concretely down to about 6 people. And then if I say the first violin or the concert master of the New York Philharmonic, then you know we're speaking about only one person on the entire planet. So taking this trip from abstract ideas to concrete brings clarity where there was confusion. As we go through the rest of the discussion, try to remember how important a concrete idea really is. Defining terms requires a concrete idea. Let me give you an example. Is helping people an abstract or a clear idea? Actually, it's a very abstract idea. Earlier I talked about doing their laundry for them. That's helping people. But you don't have much clarity about how it's being done. Many things help people. You can donate money to them. You can wash their dishes, cut their lawn, walk their dog, etc. But we're trying to get more concrete here because helping people is very vague. It's not specific. It has no clarity. Let's move along on that thinking. Confucius said that if you chase 2 rabbits, they're both going to get away. And so finding an idea that is crisp and clear is one that you can grab a hold of and do something more with. A clear objective increases specificity, which opens the door to predictability. And I'm going to show you where predictability is essential for the application of science. Predictability is the opposite of randomness, too. It's a key element, not just in science, but in other parts of life. It's not about good luck. In fact, we may say, well, things just happen sometimes, but in reality, we'd like to have predictability. Chiropractic has its roots in specificity. Even though D.D. Palmer began from a condition-centered place, he began by asking specific types of questions which were different. He was seeking the answers to questions that evolved over a 5-year period of time, and these very specific questions led to predictable answers. In 1904, D.D. Palmer wrote in The Chiropractor, a publication that he circulated, I began magnetic healing in 1886, but I didn't do it the way everyone else did. I did it more specifically. Then he asked physicians why one person would have a sickness and another living in the same conditions would become well. Physicians answered by saying they would give remedies. But D.D. Palmer said, I did not want to know what remedies they would give. I wanted to know what the difference between the healthy person and the sick person was. And that's a whole different kind of question than others were asking back in the 1880s and 1890s. He said that in his first practice of 10 years, he treated nerves, and I was aware, he said, that I was treating only the effects. It took years to discover and develop that which I named chiropractic. D.T. Palmer studied those questions, and he started out with one that sounded like this. Why would I treat the whole body as a magnetic healer? He poured his magnetism from one hand to the other. That was a little different than what other magnetic healers of the day were doing. And instead of treating the whole body, he would only treat the sick organ. He asked the question, like, if that one organ is sick, why treat the whole body? Why not just treat the problem area? And so even though condition-centered, we're moving with specific thinking into an evolution of thought. And then he asked, why is the liver even sick at all? And the next question is, well, what made it weak if it's sick? And so there he was kind of stuck for a while, and then he determined that it was because it wasn't getting its proper energy or strength. And so that led him onto the pursuit of, well, where does the strength of an organ come from? And that determination of the time period was that it came from the nerve system itself, meaning from the brain. And so why wasn't the nerve supply getting through? And there was a sticking point for a long time. And he found the specific answer with the Harvey Lillard incident. Now, as many of you are very familiar with the Harvey Lillard incident, I don't need to tell you that, but I would like to give you more illustration of how it came about. It did bring up a whole new set of questions. What difference was there in the two people, the sick person and the well person, that allowed one to become ill whenever anything was going around and the other stayed strong? That question troubled people for thousands of years until the Harvey Lillard incident in 1895 helped D.D. Palmer to answer that question. We're going to let BJ explain that to you with a little clip here, if I can make this one work. 1895.
And the next thought, where does the life come from? Why, it comes from the brain. Then the next thought was, why isn't it yet getting from the brain to the liver? And there he was stuck. And there he was stuck until the Harvey Lillard episode. And let me repeat that. Harvey Lillard was his genesis. And Harvey Lillard was a colored man. Father said to him one day, Harvey, how long have you been deaf? Father said, 17 years. Well, what was the occasion of your going deaf, Harvey? Well, I was in a still cramped position. And I heard and felt something pop in my neck. Father said, let me look at your neck. So Father took off his coat and collar and such. Father looked at the neck. And there, by one of those miraculous catches of 1,000 cases, was a great big protuberance of a bump sticking way out. And Father pressed on it. And when he did, Harvey winced with pain. He said, that hurt. Father said, well, now show you the line of thinking. If the production of this bump destroys hearing, the reduction of this bump ought to restore hearing. And so he asked Harvey to lay down on the floor, and for 3 successive days, Father pushed that bump, and Harvey's hearing was completely restored.
And so that was the Harvey Lillard incident that made all the difference. D.D. Palmer's questions were philosophic in nature. So what you can take from that piece of information is that scientific inquiry is a method for seeking answers to questions, but ultimately philosophy gives birth to science. And it never ever happens any other way. First, you have to be asking the right question before you can start to find the right answer. Philosophy evolves when we ask those questions, and values are derived from that new knowledge. Philosophy, though, is often misunderstood. And so I'd like to take a moment to talk to you about what exactly is philosophy and what is its value. We'll begin by looking at the word philosophy itself. And here in English, we know that it's derived from the Greek. Philos, or phil, in Greek means the love of something, and osophy means wisdom. So philosophy is a love of wisdom. And so from the ancient Greeks, we know that the purpose of philosophy is to lead us to a basic understanding of reality. And how do we get to that reality? We ask the questions that we use the science to try to answer. Sometimes people get confused, however. That's a good stopping point. So to clarify the distinctions between philosophy and religion, we'll look at the components of each and see how they're distinct. The first one is that religions are based in authority. We have the ultimate authority of a supreme being, God, etc. We have the multiple levels within churches and synagogues. Rabbis are an authority, priests are an authority, and so you have people within a congregation looking to higher levels for guidance. That's typical. The second characteristic is that religion is expressed as a dogma. And by dogma, we don't mean good or bad, but dogma would indicate that religion doesn't change based upon the whims or the desires of people who adhere to a religion. Religion is set in stone. In fact, a good example would be the 10 Commandments. It's not up to me to decide that I want to have 12 commandments or only 8 if I don't like one or two of them. That is not a changeable thing. So in religion, nothing changes, therefore the word dogma, no change. The third characteristic is that, and probably the highest characteristic of religion, is that it is based on faith. We say that faith is the belief in things for which you don't have tangible evidence. And so these are characteristics of religion. Let's see how that contrasts with philosophy. Philosophy, instead of being based in an authority, is based in logic and reasoning. The second characteristic is that philosophy evolves. Unlike dogmatic ideas that will not change, as we get more information in a philosophy, we change our system and our understanding. The third characteristic is we only accept in a philosophy based upon a proven validity. And so much different concepts, both useful in the endeavors of people, but we need to not be confusing the one with the other. So we're going to look at how philosophy within chiropractic led to an evolving model. We started with what we would call a very condition-centered approach, and then we're looking at the purpose of this presentation to talk about a vertebral subluxation-centered model. Now in philosophy we have 4 major branches, and we're going to look at, there's also a number of sub-branches, but we're going to look at the 4 major ones first of all. Okay. The first one is called epistemology, and epistemology deals with our ability to understand what we know. If we say, how do I know this is true? That is a study of epistemology. The second major branch we're going to look at is logic. Logic and reasoning is our ability to take the information we have and draw conclusions that are sound, and using our reasoning process, it leads us to inescapably accurate places. Now, the next one is called ethics. Ethics has to do with our values, our morality, and ultimately we use ethics to determine how we want to live. And the fourth one is aesthetics. In that fourth major branch of philosophy, we're looking at things like art, music, the things of the feeling nature of a person. Now of these 4 major branches today, and you keep in mind there's many sub-branches of philosophy that we're not even going to start to look at today. But of those 4, we're only going to look at 2 of these now. The first one being logic or reasoning, and the second one being epistemology. So we're going to delve into those a little bit further and see how they how they work for us. And there's just a few key points that affect this vertebral subluxation-centered model. First one, epistemology. What's really true in life? People have struggled with this for eons of time. And in the example here, we see the little cricket cartoon guy telling Pinocchio, the bigger cartoon guy, that he shouldn't tell a lie. Epistemology is about what's true. The second one is logic. For instance, here's an example. If this ball is green all over, we can say it does not have black spots. That's logic. If you see black spots, you can no longer say it's green all over, and etc. So, epistemology is that branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and scope of knowledge. And here we see Pinocchio being told by the cricket, the truth will set you free. We value truth in many ways, and in order to understand our model, we need to know what's true for us. How do you get knowledge? How is it acquired? What is knowledge in the first place? And how do we know what we know? And then how do we know how to value what we know? So we're going to look at certain criteria that help us to determine when we're seeing the truth or when we're not seeing the truth. And so we're going to call these the criteria. Now we know of at least 20 based upon the various philosophy texts that I've read over the years, but there's at least 20 known criteria. There are probably a few more, and some of them are very strong and useful. Others are rather weak. But we're going to look at criteria that you and I as people use all the time. We don't usually do it consciously, but we do it. Here's one that's, for an example, tradition. What we do over a long period of time registers to us as something more valid. We say it stood the test of time, perhaps. A good example, a friend of mine told me of how whenever he went for a Christmas dinner at his in-laws' house, that his mother-in-law would always cut the end of the ham off before baking it in the baking pan to cook it. And one day he asked his mother-in-law, "Why is it you always cut the end of the ham off?" And she said, "Oh, well, the truth of the matter is I can't fit the whole ham in my small baking pan." So the tradition in that case, while it happened every single year, did not bring us close to a reason that's valid for why a ham has to have its end cut off. One example. Another example, in the United States, we talk about Santa Claus at Christmas time, and we say that Santa loves cookies and milk, therefore children all over the country leave cookies and milk out for Santa Claus. Does that mean that Santa Claus is real? Well, if we're looking epistemologically, we would say, no, that's just a silly tradition. And we have others in different parts of the world. In Japan, I understand we have KFC for Christmas. Does that mean that Santa-san is a real character? Well, of course it does not. But tradition, we would then say, as a general idea, is a very weak criterion for finding the truth. But people live by their traditions. We also say, a little loud, sorry about the volume. We also say that what stands the test of time must be valid. And so we know that a Beethoven symphony has lasted for hundreds of years, therefore making it of great value to people. On the other hand, we also know that things that are not valid may last for hundreds of years. I have to stop. Let me pause a moment. Okay, so we have this idea that what is true for a long period of time or has stood the test of time must be valid or true. And a good example would be a Beethoven symphony, where the music was beloved for hundreds of years and continues to be part of the symphony repertoire today. However, we also know that things that last for a long time aren't necessarily true. For instance, for hundreds of years, it was believed that objects that are heavier will fall to the ground faster than objects that are lighter. And that was a belief since the time of Aristotle. However, we found out during the time of Galileo that when he dropped objects from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, some heavy and some light, that they both hit the ground at exactly the same time, disproving the theory of Aristotle that had been in vogue for hundreds of years as well. So time does not mean something is true, it's just a guide. And so we'll call that a little stronger criterion than tradition, but it's still a weak criterion in finding truth in this world. Here's one that I like to talk about because chiropractors often make the mistake of participating in something called transferred authority. Transferred authority is when an authority in one field takes on or assumes a certain level of authority in another field for which that person may have no training at all. And so an example of a popular television show, popular in North America, I'm not sure about in Japan, but this show is about doctors who are really actors. They have no training in sciences or healthcare, and so we would not expect to be able to use their information to deal with a healthcare thing. And so transferred authority in this case was, I'm not a doctor, but I portray one on TV. So if you had a broken arm, would you go to one of these actors to try to get to the bone in your arm set because they have a transferred authority? Of course, that would be ridiculous. But we see examples of this all the time. I'm reminded of a time when I was a child on the playground in school. And I think I was about 7 or 8 years old. And one day another child fell down and began to cry because he had scraped up his arm. So all of us other children came around and we were going to try to soothe his problem and help him with his injured arm. And another little girl marched to the front of the group and said, I'm going to help him because my mother is a nurse. Well, of course, her mother may have training in healthcare and first aid, but the child that said she's going to help had no authority whatsoever or no training. So we call this transferred authority, and we see it in chiropractic often. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. Another stronger criterion for truth is called correspondence. Correspondence is when an idea or a statement in reality corresponds to the real thing. For instance, if I were to say that in the United States, the president's home, the White House, is in Washington, D.C., and you were to get into your car and drive to Washington and find the White House exactly where I said it was, you would say that's an example of correspondence where the idea actually does correspond to reality. A strong criterion for finding truth. Coherence is another very strong criterion. In coherence, it's a systematic, consistent, and the word consistent is an important one to think about here, but a consistent explanation of all the known facts. It's not contradictory, it works every single time, and so when we say an idea is coherent, we can depend upon there being no exceptions. That's why consistency is important to consider. Albert Einstein, the great physicist, said, God does not play dice with the universe, meaning things are always coherent, there's always a reason, it's never just left up to chance. So there you have one of the stronger criteria for truth. Coherence, by many, is considered to be one of the strongest criteria. Marcus Aurelius said that nothing has such power to expand the mind as the ability to systematically and truly investigate everything that comes under your observation. So again, think in terms of consistency. Things always make sense. And when it's coherent, we call that a strong criterion for identifying truth in this life. Rigorous consistency is another important one and amongst the stronger consistencies, or strongest criteria, I should say. These are non-contradictory statements. If you find an inconsistency, then you know you're dealing with a problem with the criteria of truth. Einstein again said this, no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. However, a single experiment can prove me wrong. So we look for consistency in the sciences, and the sciences use consistency all the time as an important criterion. we could say that if all generals in the Army are soldiers, and Juan Valdez is a general in the Army, therefore he is a soldier. That's a consistency. In rigorous consistency, we have the non-contradictory statements. For instance, Buckminster Fuller, who invented this thing called the geodesic dome, said principles never contradict principles. Consistency. Now, we've reviewed a few of the weak criteria, and we've reviewed a few of the strong criteria. Of the three strongest ones, think about consistency as a key element in science. Consistency is reflected and centered, or reflected and used in vertebral subluxation centered model, and I'll show you how that works next. D.D. Palmer believed that science demands consistency, and specificity was his method of finding consistency. He said chiropractic is a science just so far as it is specific. The ability to discriminate, to be precise, makes chiropractic a science and an art. That's in his 1,000-page textbook, page 622. Palmer refined his ideas into very concrete concepts. He said chiropractic is founded upon the principle that all functions are performed through nerves in the body, that health is a condition where the controlling intelligence is able to get mental impulses through the nerves out to all the body parts. Page 786 in his textbook. He said consistent application of this principle is the first step away from the usual condition-centered thinking. In D.D. Palmer's words, he said we're leaving therapeutical thinking and moving into something else, which he called causes. We see that movement a few pages later in his textbook, where he said chiropractors do not treat, cure, heal, or diagnose disease. As a science, it is not like any other system. It does not mix with any other system. Chiropractors do not treat, cure, or heal effects. And that was some of the earliest change away from the condition-centered model into what we have evolved into today. What began as a treatment for deafness in Harvey Lillard soon became chiropractic corrects the cause. Now, we're going to say that's an intermediary step, not the place where we are in the vertebral subluxation centered model. Palmer's movement away from treating effects, though, was an essential step. If he hadn't moved that way, we would never have gotten to where we are today. Still condition-centered, the objective had changed from treating effects to correcting causes. And in fact, when I was in college in the 1970s, everybody was talking about we fix the cause instead of treating the effect. But again, that's not where we are now. We've gone another step, and we'll talk about that next. It took more than 70 years before the vertebral subluxation centered model clearly evolved from that correcting cause model. A growing body of knowledge related to the nature of vertebral subluxation is what led to this current paradigm that this presentation is all about right now. So we have the overwhelming evidence that adjusting vertebral subluxations does precede changes in symptoms and conditions. A good example is the Harvey Lillard case, where he had a subluxation which did seem to be causing his deafness. But do you suppose his subluxation could have caused other problems? If Harvey didn't have deafness, would it be a good idea to wait until some other symptoms showed up in order to know whether or not to adjust his vertebral subluxation? And so this is the kind of thinking that leads us out of the condition-centered model. Do symptoms help us find vertebral subluxations? People often observe that they have various symptoms when they have a subluxation. I hear it here in my practice every day. People will come in and say, I've got a headache, I bet my neck is out. And so we have strong thinking relationships between the symptom and the subluxation. But that's a problem. The relationship between symptoms and subluxations can be very indirect. It's not always that atlas subluxation or that C2 that's causing someone's headache. Symptoms may or may not relate to the location, time, or character of a subluxation, and this becomes the problem. Inadequate predictability is questionable science. Now, when I say inadequate predictability, that's the opposite of consistency, which, remember, science demands consistency. The relationship between symptoms and subluxation is not consistent enough for scientific analysis of vertebral subluxation. And that's a real problem. People coming in here say, well, I've got a leg pain, I bet you need to adjust this thing here or that thing there, and that's not science. So in order to do a scientific analysis, we need to start to realize how unreliable these symptoms can be. Although it originated in the condition-centered model, the Palmers continuously sought more specific methods to detect and correct the vertebral subluxation. And this is what caused us to evolve out of the condition-centered place. Increasing predictability and specificity impelled the objective further from symptoms and conditions. And we really owe that to the work of B.J. Palmer, which followed quite naturally what his father founded. And we see it a good example, and we're going way back to the 1930s now, between 1935 and 1951, when B.J. Palmer founded the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic. And this is a picture of the people in the clinic. And there they did studies and published studies on over 200,000 people, which is a huge body of evidence. And I want to see if I can, this is a silent clip, but I want to see if I can share that. Here's an example of silent film back in the 1930s when B.J. Palmer was doing some of the earliest work to understand patterns of interference that were showing up with neurocalometer measurements. And it says here that after a decision is reached, B.J. Palmer makes the adjustment. And of course, this is very old footage and kind of rough looking, but you get the idea of there's B.J. setting up a patient for a toggle recoil adjustment. And a very quick toggle. And then in this particular promotional video, he's showing how the post-check is done and how the post-check looks different from the original pattern that you saw. And this is using one of the earliest neurocalometers with a paper chart recorder, and this was devised in the late 1930s. And he's showing a change from a pattern to a relatively straight line, although that's not our goal today. It is interesting to see what happened there when they did these studies. Let me see if I can make this work. I'm trying to get off of the screen. Nope. Go back to the next slide. Okay, and so some of the research pamphlets, they were printed on paper stock. This booklet was on electrocardiograph changes of 1,500 cases. That's a huge study by any standards, even with today's modern research efforts. You don't see thousands of patients typically being evaluated. 2,000 cases on urological changes. There were a whole series of these booklets put out by the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic. 1,029 cases of hearing changes, basal metabolic changes, 909 cases. So they did some pretty serious tabulating of data. Now, D.D. Palmer said chiropractic includes the art of adjusting vertebrae and the reason for doing it. And let me just see if I can make this one work. And resolutely committed to that perspective, D.D. Palmer served time in jail to advance the new profession, and many others did follow in his footsteps. So I want to see if I can show you a short clip of a person who did follow in the footsteps of D.D. Palmer. and going to jail for that purpose. Here we are. Herb Reaver served jail sentences 12 times in the state of Ohio.
The other
And
question I have is,
here he is in his
your many years of
90s.
practice, we went to school.
I think he's about 95 years old
all these
here.
things. How do you assess a case now, and what's your initial evaluation? If a patient lays on a table, do you consider the autonomic nervous system and think about these things and organ diseases? How do you evaluate a patient when they lay down on the table? I know you have a lot of experience and a lot of innate thinking. How do you go about it?
How do I evaluate a
How do you
patient?
evaluate the treatment of the patient with all your years of experience?
I guess what you mean, what do I do
Yeah,
with my sick people?
right.
Well, the doctor means well, and I know where he's coming from. It's no great secret. I get my patient's history, and I determine their subluxations and start adjusting them. And that's it.
So the reason I show you that clip was that I believe very few of us today would really want to spend time in jail for something that we believe in. But this man, Herb Reaver, went to jail 12 times before he decided to move out of the state of Ohio and try to move his profession forward from other places. Joseph Strauss said, when chiropractors were being jailed for practicing medicine, the defense of the profession was based on specificity, and it was granted licensure laws based on the argument that chiropractic is not the practice of medicine, it's the adjustment of vertebral subluxation. So specificity becomes a key point here, and we'll see how that plays into the evolving of the vertebral subluxation centered model. The founder viewed specificity as a prerequisite to any scientific practice. He said chiropractors should be specific, making one simple movement in the spine at a particular spot and in the right direction. That's specific. He said, this makes chiropractic a science, specificity. Why not learn it as a science? And then he asks, why adjust through the whole spinal column? Now, the context here isn't, do you adjust only one area of the spine, but the context is we shouldn't be putting lots of careless forces at people in the hope that we'll get something done right. Our analysis should be precise, it should be specific, and it should have an intention. There should be a predictable outcome as well. Here's a photo of Murakubo, the only photo I've ever seen of D.D. Palmer doing an adjustment on Shigetaro Murakubo. And he said in his book, this book has been written for the purpose of teaching chiropractic as a science to make the art of adjusting specific. D.D. Palmer also said, knowing the locality, we should be specific in determining by palpation, which was his main tool of that day, the nerve impinged upon, saying which nerves are being impinged upon, which vertebra is being displaced, and the direction it should be moved in order to rack it to its normal position and then act accordingly. This was not a hit it here, hit it there, and hope for the best. And this was at the very beginnings of our profession. Early spinal analysis consisted of detecting a vertebral subluxation. The literature says that nerve tracing and the Merrick system were the earliest additions to that process, and that's prior to 1905. Chiropractic analysis is arrived at by vertebral palpation, nerve tracing, and the knowledge of symptomatology. So even in those early days, they were still relating the condition to what they found by palpating and nerve tracing. In fact, nerve tracing required the subjective input of the patient to tell you where it hurt. And this is 1920 in the B.J. Palmer's technique textbook. Oh. We need a pause. And so, you ready? Nerve tracing requires a patient's subjective input, which is clearly in the condition-centered model. Now, going back to 1910, B.J. Palmer was looking for greater specificity through technology, and the best technology of that day was the X-ray. In 1910, he did a very controversial move when he brought X-ray into the Palmer School training package. In fact, there was quite an upset amongst faculty who thought that it didn't belong in chiropractic, but B.J. was never afraid to use technology to its fullest. He also did something called tracings of people's X-rays to see before and after adjustment. In the red we see before adjustment, in the blue we see after adjustment. Of course, they took a lot of X-rays in those days, far more than we might today, trying to learn how that tool could be used. He continued to be the driving force for progress in vertebral subluxation-centered analysis. And in the 1920s, we can see B.J. demonstrating the first of high-low tables, which was a brand new invention at that time, but cutting-edge technology. One of the things I think about as a practitioner for many years now, having probably most of my career behind me, not ahead of me, is that we haven't seen a lot of dramatic improvement in the technology available to the chiropractor for the analysis and correction of vertebral subluxation during the past 50 years. It seemed like a lot of it was going on back then, and we haven't been doing much since. There's the earliest neurokilometer. You see a picture of Dasa Evans, 1924. When we look at our Titron scanners today, all we really have is an advancement of what was really developed back in the 1920s. In the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic, they were looking for not the treatment of effects, symptoms, or pathology, but ways of becoming more specific for both the cause and the adjustment of a vertebral subluxation. The B.J. Palmer Chiropractic Clinic, he said, we give only one adjustment in one or two places. We secure longer intervals, that is holding adjustments, and better and quicker results. The idea here wasn't that upper cervical was necessarily the answer, although it was a great part of it. But what he was doing was asking the right questions. How do we get more specific? In 1935 through 1951, the studies of those 200,000 cases were released, and what they demonstrated was that thermographic patterns for a patient were a lot like a fingerprint. They became uniquely what a person looked like when they were carrying nerve interference. And they also spearheaded further development of more and more adjusting equipment and better equipment to take the thermographic findings. There was a time in the 1930s when BJ spent over $100,000, which in today's money would be far more than that, and he funded the development of the electroencephaloneuromontigraph. This was an instrument based upon the technology of that day, the best technology of the 1930s, made by the General Electric Corporation for B.J. Palmer, and that would have been equivalent to over $2 million in today's money, US dollars, of course. Here's a picture of B.J. with the patient lying down and 8 electrodes contacting different parts of the skin to try to measure what happens with various ability of the mental impulse to get from the brain of the patient throughout the body. There was experimentation, but he was asking the right kind of questions, and what he determined through those many years in the research clinic is when not to adjust is more important than when to adjust, when to back off and leave the patient alone. Mission drives methods. Research does not drive culture. Now, earlier in this discussion, we talked about mission and method, and I want to bring you back to think about how that relates to what we do in our research picture today. What we know is that while mission drives method, research is not driven by science, it's driven by culture. Culture is many different things, but it can be religious belief, it can be convenience, it can be attitudes, it can be profit. But culture drives research, not science. I hate to have to tell you that. Here's an example of some revealing research. What we know is that at the University of Southern California, they determined that taking an aspirin once a day cuts the risk of heart disease by 1%, and cancer is reduced by 0.4%, premature death reduced by 0.8%. That's a serious study funded by the United States government at the University of Southern California. Another piece of research done at the same time period, within a few months, within a few days of this one being released, found that a handful of nuts being eaten each day by a patient cuts the risk of coronary heart disease by 30% compared to 1% with an aspirin, cut cancer by 15% compared to 0.4%, and premature death by 22% instead of 0.8%. The bottom line, however, is that this is what physicians decide to do, and research is not driven by the outcome, it's driven by what's financially lucrative. Instead, culture, power, and money drives the research. Here's another example. A few years ago in 2020, when we were having the hysteria of a pandemic, the first funding of the United States government was to give $10 billion to give, not to loan, but to give the pharmaceutical companies $10 billion to start with. Many other billions followed. And they were charged with producing and delivering 300 million doses of safe, effective vaccines by the following year. The problem with this is they already decided how they're going to solve the problem without any scientific research. They gave them billions of dollars to create a vaccine that they didn't even know if it was going to work. So that's what drives research. Chiropractic's contemporary culture is this. In North America today, most chiropractors are driven by insurance reimbursement, not by specificity or science. Third-party pay demands condition-centered coding, which means that for a chiropractor to send a claim to an insurance company, they must have a condition-centered reason. If you don't have a headache, back pain, radiculitis, or some other symptom, an insurance company will not pay for the care. They won't pay for just finding and correcting the cause of distortion to the mental impulse. The condition-centered model has led to the deterioration of the vertebral subluxation training in colleges. Chiropractors being created by our colleges today are not nearly as good at finding and correcting vertebral subluxations as they used to be. They're continuing on that path. All North American chiropractic educational programs, condition-centered. That is their drive. That's the problem we have today. Now I wanted to get you to think a little bit about what is going on in the chiropractic profession. Even a journal that's dedicated to expanding knowledge of vertebral subluxation, and this is the Annals of Vertebral Subluxation Research, is going to be hard to find a relevant study. Now this is probably the best of all of the journals that exist about vertebral subluxation today. But here's a recent issue of that journal, and we're going to look at each one of these studies being put out. And remember, this is the Vertebral Subluxation Research Journal. And what's the first study? About sensor motor function. The second study is Achilles heel tension test. Third study, scoliosis treatment. Next study, fibromyalgia symptoms. Next study, blood pressure changes. Next study, post-traumatic anosmia. Next study, lymphatic drainage. The point is simple. in this entire issue, there wasn't one study about vertebral subluxation itself. They're all about conditions and effects, how well we balance when we walk. And so the point is that when we look at what's out there in research and what's going on to improve the quality of what we do chiropractically, there's a real paucity. And so we talked about levels of abstraction earlier in this presentation. I want to show you how that applies to the research world. Increasing the body of knowledge is the goal of all research, no matter what kind we know of in the world. We want to increase the body of knowledge, but it's a very abstract idea. It's not a concrete idea. As we go down, we'll find knowledge about the physical realm becomes a little more concrete. Biological study, more concrete. Studying in the animal kingdom. Oh, now we're leaving the abstract and getting closer to vertebral subluxation. The study of the vertebrate or the invertebrate, more and more concrete. Fish, birds, and mammals, more concrete. The study of human function. Now we're getting closer and closer. And knowledge about the nerve system. As you can see, we go from the abstract. Pretty soon we're approaching what we want to know something about. And then, of course, the concrete would be the vertebral subluxation itself. Here's what I would say we need to consider. The chiropractic research community suffers with something called the street light effect. Here's what I mean by the street light effect. Imagine you're on a university campus and it's nighttime, and crawling around the ground here is a drunken college student. Had too many beers or something else today. And he's pawing the ground trying to find something. And along comes a campus police officer and says, "Young man, what are you looking for?" And the young man said, "I lost my keys." And so the police officer's looking around while the student is trying to find his keys under the street light. And the police officer said, "Well, do you remember when you lost your keys?" He said, "Yeah, I do. I was on the other side of the parking lot. And I dropped them and I haven't been able to find them." She said, "Well, why are you looking over here when you dropped them on the other side of the parking lot?" And he said, "Well, here's where the light is." Now in research, we have the street light effect. We go where the funding is. We don't go where the issue that we need to be studying is. And that's what I think our chiropractic research community has been doing. As we look at the culture of our profession today, I'm reminded of what Joseph Keating said when he looked at how the education of chiropractors used to be about vertebral subluxation, and somehow we got away from that early style of education, and we were challenged or unchallenged and focused on the subluxation, but we got away from that into better condition-centered methods of training. It's an authoritatively controlled profession, and these agencies, we call them the cartel, the Council on Chiropractic Education, the Federation of State Licensing Boards, the National Board of Chiropractic Examiners, the World Federation of Chiropractic. They act as one conglomerate, moving chiropractic toward a condition-centered only agenda, which means that the vertebral subluxation-centered part of it gets lost along the way. There's even a hostile attitude toward specificity. In colleges, we have technique teachers saying all techniques work. That's a crazy idea when you think about it, but they're saying it all the time. All techniques work. The implication is that an adjustment is just a manipulation. That whatever you do, it's going to work out, so don't worry. That's crazy. Do all techniques really work? Claiming that all techniques work is a tradition that flies in the face of consistency and coherence. Here's what I mean. What if we decided that jumping on a trampoline would be a chiropractic technique? Now, putting forces into the body may very well cause a vertebra to move to its proper position. Now, the odds aren't too great, but it could happen. If we decided that that's a chiropractic technique, would it result in safe, effective, predictable correction of a vertebral subluxation, and could you do it consistently? Well, when you look at those ideas, you say, well, that's totally absurd. Even though it's possible for a subluxation to be corrected by jumping on a trampoline. It makes no sense whatsoever as a method. It has no specificity whatsoever. Adjustment versus manipulation should be considered. We see chiropractic faculty members talking about what they do as a manipulation. That's a horrible idea. Manipulate, let's look at what it means to handle and move in an examination for a therapeutic purpose. To adjust is different. To bring into proper relationship, to bring to a proper state or position. Much different ideas, but I want to show you why these words matter. Numerous peer-reviewed publications reveal that manipulation is rather dangerous. We should never confuse those two terms. Here's a Journal of Neurology. In this study, they found 36 patients experienced vertebral artery dissection within 12 hours of having their neck manipulated. And we see strokes and other similar vertebral artery dissection problems. Another study, this one is the association of spinal manipulative therapy with clinical benefit and harm. This was a 2017 study in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. In pediatrics, the conclusion of this study was that serious adverse events may be associated with pediatric manipulation of children. So, dangerous stuff. The International Journal of Clinical Practice, strokes typically involving vertebral artery dissection can follow cervical spinal manipulative therapy. Do you really want to be manipulators? This literature review of 14 cases concluded that upper spinal manipulation is associated with ophthalmological adverse effects. People losing their eyesight because of having manipulation of their cervical spine. All of these studies have one thing in common. They suggest that manipulation can be dangerous and unpredictable, and that's the problem with manipulation. It is unpredictable. D.D. Palmer said, "I adjust only one vertebra, making the adjustment direct and specific, the difference being that one move adjusts while the other manipulates." We've known the difference since the profession began, yet today we seem to be ignoring that there is a difference. Studies have previously shown that adverse effects following manipulation to the neck and back are relatively common. This study involved over 1,000 patients with 83 chiropractors. In this study, 83 chiropractors performed more than 5 million upper cervical adjustments without a reported, not even one serious adverse effect. So an adjustment with precision, with intention, and predictability is not dangerous. Manipulation, there's a lot of evidence, is dangerous. So here's how chiropractors view this reality. This is a study done every 5 years by the National Board of Chiropractic Examiners in the United States. And here's what you as a profession, you meaning North American chiropractors, told them in the survey that you value. What we learned that's interesting about this is most chiropractors value the pre-check, the analysis before doing an adjustment. They also value diagnosis, which baffles me because it's not relevant to knowing whether or not a person needs an adjustment. They value an x-ray somewhat, but not very much. And they barely value post-check at all. Fewer than half as many chiropractors responding to the survey value a post-check. The question is, why don't we value a post-check? If we're going to have a predictable outcome, we should see a change. The National Board of Examiners conducted this every 5 years, and these surveys indicate certain things that the chiropractors like to do, which techniques we use. One of them is we find that 96% of chiropractors use diversified technique as their primary method. We find that 70% are using activator, 61% Thompson, Gonstead 57, 57% Cox, SOT 50%, applied kinesiology 38. The difference is you'll notice a certain tendency about which are the more popular techniques and which are the less popular techniques. And what we found by studying the National Board data is that those methods that are easy to learn and apply is what chiropractors tend to do. As it becomes more difficult to learn or apply, fewer chiropractors try to do it, and the more complex, the fewer chiropractors seem to be involved. Now, that's the reality of where the profession is today. So how far can you walk into a forest? How do you decide what you're doing and whether what you're doing is working, and is it appropriate? Is it achieving your objective? We know this. You can only walk into a forest halfway, because once you're halfway in, you're on the way out. And so we're going to divide this into the immaterial and the material, the intelligence and the matter, and look at how this might apply. D.D. Palmer discovered a principle that unites the material and the immaterial. That's what he said he did by discovering that a vertebral subluxation interferes with the flow of life in the body. And so we find in chiropractic that chiropractors tend to lean one way or the other. They tend to focus too much on the immaterial, or that the typical signs is, well, all techniques work. That's the immaterial. Doesn't matter how you do it, it's going to work out okay. And then we find those who are a little too strongly focused on the material. Typical signs are they tend to be condition-centered, they tend to be mechanistic in nature. And what we'd like to see is that we unite the material and the immaterial. We kind of like to see the chiropractors using both of those and finding a proper center. And so predictability in the scientific method, here's how science works. We have a hypothesis, we reason things out, we do deductions, we use our logic and our math, we make observations, we perform experiments, and then we reproduce the experiment. And the predictability part comes in right here. We need to be able, in science, to have a predictable outcome for whatever we're doing. When the outcome is not predictable, then the scientific method is not at work. And so, let's go back to some of the studies. In this study, we find that the literature review of adjusting techniques, motion palpation, movement palpation, leg length measurements, applied kinesiology, SOT, a study on reliability and validity of spinal analysis. Let's see what they found. They found that thus far no manual or visual test has been identified that fulfills minimal criteria of consistent reliability and validity. Procedures found to be useless should be excluded from our repertoire, and useful tests should be promoted. Now that's quite an indictment of the things we do. And we've all had the experience of walking up to an adjusting table and looking at a leg length equality and seeing a right short or a left short, looking at it again and seeing just the reverse. These are the problems with things that are not predictable. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we need to do these things with the most predictable, consistent applications so that we're aware of the problem that exists with invalid methods. The consistency problems. Do symptoms help identify the vertebral subluxations? People often observe various symptoms when they have a subluxation, and the relationship between the symptom and the subluxation can be rather indirect. And that can mislead us about the location, the time, and the character of the subluxation. Since symptoms are subjective and inconsistent, that brings this thought to mind. Why do we do the adjustment? Is it to chase the symptom or change it? How do we determine when to do the adjustment? And what is the role of the objective data? What role could subjective data play? One possibility of subjective data, the symptom, is it may help the patient decide to get checked. That's probably the best thing we can hope from subjective data. And the other is that it might interfere with the chiropractor's objective decision making. So we need to stay aware of that. Our profession centers its marketing on relief of symptoms. If you ever look at what chiropractors are putting in front of patients, as a general rule, they're talking about how to feel better. And we'll look at some of our experts that we respect in the profession. Here's Vern Pierce saying most chiropractors practice symptoms. Don't pretend that taking away symptoms means that you've made a correction. Sometimes we just change the symptoms. That's an unpredictable outcome. And for those who are not familiar, Vern Pierce, now deceased, was the leader of the Pierce-Stillwagon technique, and he was an innovator in X-ray, motion X-ray, instrumentation, and adjusting equipment. Vern Pierce said you should know when to adjust and when you should keep your hands off of people. How many of you would go to a dentist who wants to drill all 32 teeth just to make sure he gets the right one? And yet we find chiropractors doing things like that, putting forces into multiple segments, just hoping to get the right one. Clarence Gonstead, one of the great minds of our profession and technique developer, said that in a different way, find it, fix it, and leave it alone. Let the body do what the body does. So Tom Gilardi, the Sherman College founder, said in an article where he wrote about what's relevant analytically, and he was quoting a Dr. Harold Clowens, a neurology professor, who was talking about the distinctions and the differences between a psychiatric and a neurological problem. And Dr. Clowens said that a psychiatric exam does not help with a neurologic diagnosis, but it can mislead the diagnostician. He said that being crazy, and that's not a good word to use in these days, but that's his word, being crazy or having a psychiatric problem does not protect you from being involved in a disease. He said whether the patient has a neurologic problem is a question to be answered on neurologic grounds, and you shouldn't prejudice yourself by knowing whether or not there are psychiatric problems there. Now, Gilardi said that logical thinking translates into chiropractic. Don't make a medical exam. It can only mislead you. Almost all people have one disease or another anyway, and having a disease does not protect you from having a subluxation. Whether or not a patient has a subluxation is a question to be answered on chiropractic grounds. All of these greats in chiropractic basically said the same thing. We need to know when to adjust and when not to adjust. BJ said in the evolution of all adjusting, the desire has always been to see how little invasionary force we could use, to see how much it made possible an innate response, and to set and seat the subluxation naturally and normally. Lyle Sherman, the namesake of Sherman College, is here speaking about a chiropractor who failed to get results after giving his patient 500 adjustments. Let me see if I can make this one work, and I'll let you hear Dr. Sherman speaking.
He says he is not able to discourage the patient from coming. So he writes a letter to us asking an honest opinion. Don't you think, he says, that if adjustments are going to help this man, wouldn't the 500 I've given him already have helped him by this time? A student asked me recently, do you believe in specific chiropractic? I said, what do you mean, do I believe in specific chiropractic? He said, well, do you believe in Atlas and Axis adjustments? I told him I didn't think it was a matter of belief.
And so that's Dr. Sherman giving us thoughts about what he, as the assistant director of the B.J. Palmer Research Clinic, was experiencing when field doctors would send patients who were problem cases to them and not understanding how important a specific adjustment is.
He said,
let me get past that. Bill Blair, the founder of Blair Upper Cervical Technique, said that even if you have the big idea, you are worthless to the patient if you cannot correct the nerve interference. Remember, it's only during the time that an adjustment is holding that the patient is receiving a benefit. So Blair is saying you've got to keep them clear. A decision about what to do and how to do it is simplified when we have a clear practice objective. And so there's two basic types of objective in chiropractic today. The first and most common one is the condition-centered objective. Treatment is appropriate to the presenting complaint. If somebody's got a shoulder radiculitis, you're going to find something to do to make that radiculitis feel better. And then, of course, the vertebral subluxation-centered objective is not to change how we feel, but to reduce the interference with the transmission of mental impulse for a simple reason. When the brain is able to communicate with the body, life is better. The banter meaning what we do and say to people in our practices every day reveals our objective. Verbal messages, like if a patient asks you, "How are you?" to them, it's just a greeting. They walked in the door and said, "Hi, how are you?" It means nothing more. But if I, as a chiropractor, respond with a similar greeting and say, "Well, how are you?" they're not hearing a response to a simple greeting. They're hearing me ask, "How do you feel today?" It's an entirely different idea. And that's why I never ask someone, "How are you today?" because I know that that's not just a simple greeting. It means I want to know whether they're hurting. And that misses the point of a vertebral subluxation-centered objective. The vertebral subluxation-centered model says avoid inconsistency. Scheduling. The things we do in our scheduling that allow us to have enough time to do a proper analysis, do an adjustment if needed, and do a post-check. So scheduling requires a consistency. There are certain things we do in practice building that we know help build a practice. And a common one that consultants will say is, after a first adjustment, call the patient at home to see how they're feeling. It's a wonderful practice building tool, but completely undermines what we're teaching them. We're telling them it's not about how you feel, but I'm calling you to ask you how you feel. People do this because it's a practice building tool. Please don't misunderstand what your objective is. Irrelevant advice happens in practices all the time. Should I use ice or heat for my pain? Whichever way the chiropractor answers that, we've left the vertebral subluxation-centered model and moved into the condition-centered model. We don't give advice on whether ice or heat are good because we don't know. It's not our training, and it's certainly not our objective. Wearing a white clinic jacket says something. It says, I'm here as a physician trying to treat your problems, because when people see a white clinic jacket, that means something in the culture. I suggest that chiropractors have no need for a white clinic jacket. We're not getting blood and sputum and things like that splashed on us. It's inappropriate and undermines your message. Taking blood pressure, taught in every chiropractic college, has no relevance whatsoever to finding and correcting a vertebral subluxation. Advice for or against vaccination has no place in the vertebral subluxation-centered model because it's not relevant to whether or not somebody has a vertebral subluxation. Selling products in your practice, whether it's vitamins, mattresses, pillows, back supports, shoe inserts, whether or not these things are good or bad for people, they have no relevance whatsoever to the vertebral subluxation-centered objective. The objective to find out if the mental impulse is getting from brain to body has no relevance to those things, whether they're good or bad things. Taking credit for symptom improvements. People say, oh, I feel so much better today. Well, if I don't say to them, well, that might be a side effect, but that's not what we're trying to do, then I give them the idea that my goal is to help their symptoms go away. Providing physical therapy and massage therapy. Those things may be good for people, but they have no relevance whatsoever to finding and correcting vertebral subluxation. And so what we're saying is not these things are good or bad, but being consistent is a key idea in the vertebral subluxation-centered objective model. How do people view the chiropractors? We know what chiropractors do, and we know that much of it is very inconsistent. And here the Gallup organization, which is a huge North American survey organization, asked people how they view the honesty and ethics of the various professions, and I've only put a few of them up from their study. And what they said was, we view nurses as being the most honest and ethical of professions. 85% of people surveyed rated nurses very highly. 65%, quite a bit less, say they do view their medical doctors as being ethical and honest. But look where you and I came in. We're at 38%, finding their chiropractors as being not so honest and not so ethical. And I'm saying that's because of our inconsistent approach and our condition-centered training in our chiropractic colleges. But don't feel bad, because we're well above the car salespeople. We're only down at 9%. So that's what the reality of the public perception of you as chiropractors is in North America. Here's that National Board of Chiropractic Examiners survey that we talked about a few minutes ago. Chiropractors told them that condition-focused care is 92% of what we do. That's what you and I value as chiropractors. They said that they treat 89.5% of their patients for pain. And they told the National Board survey that they see non-symptomatic patients very rarely. It's only 8% of well patient care, and other conditions even less. But this is where you are at as a profession. Joe Strauss looked at chiropractors to see how consistent we are in our own beliefs compared to what that National Board survey showed. And what he found was that chiropractors, 72% get their spines checked regularly, not just for symptoms. Consistency with the practice objective is the driving force for vertebral subluxation-centered practitioners. Nothing in life is 100% consistent, of course, but here are some of the reasons to choose the vertebral subluxation-centered model. First reason is it's predictable. The outcome is that adjustments will result in a better nerve supply, better transmission of mental impulse to body parts. You can predict that. If you're successful in finding and correcting a subluxation, this is an inescapable conclusion. The second reason for choosing this model is that the predictable harm of a vertebral subluxation not adjusted is a poor nerve supply that must interfere with the transmission of mental impulse. So we're trying to avoid a problem by practicing in this model. Third reason is that achieving high levels of expertise in the vertebral subluxation-centered analysis and adjusting requires a focus on it. You can't be doing condition-centered things and be nearly as good at finding and correcting vertebral subluxation because it requires effort. Fourth reason is that logic and reasoning say that living free of interference of vertebral subluxation just makes good sense. Teaching these values to children and our practice member adults is both an honor and a privilege. And the fifth reason is we provide an unduplicated service. We find that in our practice, and that's the building we practice out of here, that many of the people we see are driving hours to get here because they know that they're going to get their spines checked and adjusted if they need it. They often drive past many, if not hundreds, of other chiropractic offices just to get here. Striving for consistency in our practice should be our objective. Things like office hours. We find that our educational program needs to reinforce consistently what we're giving. So we can't buy pamphlets that are published elsewhere. We've got to write our own so that they have a consistent message throughout each one. And we've got, I don't know, at least 10, 12 different pamphlets here that we've written in our own office and we give to people on a regular basis. Things that look at what's going on when you're subluxated and how the consistent message matters. We even give people special credit for being clear when they come in and we say, hey, we don't find any subluxations in your spine today. We give them something called a clear card. This is the front, this is the back, and we put a date stamp on each time that somebody comes in and doesn't need an adjustment. The back of the wallet card, when it's filled, entitles them to a free visit in our office. So it's a reward for not needing an adjustment. This is consistent with the vertebral subluxation centered objective. And forums like, if something has happened in your life, you've taken a fall, been in an accident, whatever, tell the chiropractor that you may or may not have had a recent subluxation. This form sits out in the reception room where people can fill it out upon arrival. Adjusting techniques and equipment are also consistent with the vertebral subluxation centered model, choosing which adjusting tables we need, choosing what type of thermographic instrumentation we need, and giving care to family members, not waiting for symptoms or conditions to show up, is consistent. Here's an educational poster that says, my mother doesn't give childhood subluxations years to cause damage. And so the message, we try to be as consistent throughout. We try to get babies checked. We want to get children checked. The frequency of care recommendations should be based upon what that person shows in their ability to maintain or hold an adjustment. It shouldn't be a recipe that says, come in 3 times a week for your first week, 2 times a week for your second week, once a week for your third week, or any of that sort of thing. What we give in a recommendation is based upon what does it take to keep a person clear of vertebral subluxation. Striving for consistency. I remember Reggie Gold saying that you need to do things that allow people to receive care in your practice. For instance, your fee system. He asks the question, could you afford to go to you? Does your fee system allow people to get care according to their need? Dr. Felicia Stewart, a colleague of mine in this community, adjusts animals, and she loves to adjust animals. And she goes every Saturday to all the horse barns in the area to give adjustments. And she's not the only chiropractor that does that, but she told me that, let me back up one, well, we'll just leave that. But back to Dr. Stewart, she said that one individual in the practice area that she sees charges $185 US for every horse adjustment. But what she found was, while she charges only $35 US, and she said that in talking with the owners of the horses, that when they see the chiropractor who charges $185 for each horse adjustment, they decide only to have crisis care for their horse. They don't provide maintenance or wellness care, which means that if the horse is subluxated, the owner never calls the chiropractor until the horse shows symptoms. That's not the vertebral subluxation centered model. So we look for consistency in everything we do. Earl Powell, the publisher of Voice for Health magazine, said many years ago, we have been working as a profession so hard for so long to become recognized that once we have recognition, we'll still not be recognized because we lost sight of what chiropractic is all about in the first place. And that unfortunately is true. Shigetaro Murakubo said way back in 1906, delivering a lecture to the graduating class at Palmer School of Chiropractic, the future growth of chiropractic depends upon the preservation of its original cleanliness. That is, its objective. Murakubo, by the way, was the first one to win a court case after D.D. Palmer was thrown in jail the year before. And so I'd like to get close to the conclusion of what we're going to say today by showing you a little clip here.
Spinning kick, spinning kick, spinning kick. Get him up there. Ready, jump around us. Good kick. Come on, kick it. One more, ready, go. Come on, kick it hard. Kick it hard. Good kick. One more time. Good kick. Up.
The point, though, is that the decisions we make are serious because the lives of people are affected. But any monkey can be trained to put a force into a spine. It needs to be thought of as something much more than just delivering forces. Oops. Let me see if I can get past that.
Spinning kick. Spinning kick. Get him up there. Ready, jump around us. Good kick. Up. Come on, kick it. One more. Ready, go. Come on.
Sorry about repeating that. I was trying to get my computer to take me past that spot. Just a little technical problem here. So our service should be to adjust people, and we should offer to keep them clear. That's the goal. Dee Dee said, chiropractic includes the art of adjusting vertebra, and the reason we do it, that's what the vertebral subluxation-centered model is all about. And BJ said, simply, chiropractic is specific or it is nothing. Thank you for your kind attention today. I hope it was useful.